Psychoanalysis has often been blamed for its so-called pansexualism. I, for one, doubt whether this reproach has ever been legitimate. However, there is something which seems to me to be an even more erroneous and dangerous assumption, namely that which I call pandeterminism. By that I mean the view of man which disregards his capacity to take a stand towards any condition whatsoever. Man is not fully conditioned and determined, but rather determines himself, whether he gives in to conditions or stands up to them. In other words, man is ultimately self-determining. Man does not simply exist, but always decides what his existence will be, what he will become in the next moment. By the same token, every human being has the freedom to change at any instant. Therefore, we can predict his future only within the large framework of a statistical survey referring to a whole group. The individual personality, however, remains essentially unpredictable. The basis for any predictions would be represented by biological, psychological, or sociological conditions. Yet one of the main features of human existence is the capacity to rise above such conditions, to grow beyond them. Tobes! Tobes! A bunch of Egypts. Come here. Come here. All right. I love you guys. This is Avery over here. Avery, come here. Come say hi. Okay. To grow beyond them. Man is capable of changing the world for the better if possible, and of changing himself for the better if necessary. Let me cite the case of Dr. J. He was the only man I ever encountered in my whole life whom I would dare to call a Mephistophelian being, a satanic figure. At that time, he was generally called the mass murderer of Steinhof, the large mental hospital in Vienna. When the Nazis started their euthanasia program, he held all the strings in his hands and was so fantastic in the job assigned to him that he tried not to let one single psychotic individual escape the gas chamber. After the war, when I came back to Vienna, I asked what had happened to Dr. J. He had been imprisoned by the Russians. In the isolation cells of Steinhof, they told me. The next day, however, the door of his cell stood open. Stop, guys. The next day, however, the door of his cell stood open, and Dr. J was never seen again. Later, I was convinced that, like others, he had, with the help of his comrades, made his way to South America. More recently, however, I was confronted by the former Australian diplomat who had been imprisoned behind the Iron Curtain for many years, first in Siberia, and then in the famous Lubyanka prison in Moscow. While I was examining him neurologically, he suddenly asked me whether I happened to know Dr. J. After my affirmative reply, he continued, I made his acquaintance in Lubyanka. There he died, at about the age of 40, from cancer of the urinary bladder. Before he died, however, he showed himself to be the best comrade you can imagine. He gave consolation to everybody. He lived up to the highest conceivable moral standard. He was the best friend I ever met during my long years in prison. This is the story of Dr. J, the mass murderer of Steinhof. How can we dare to predict the behavior of man? Stop, you guys. We may predict the movements of a machine, of an automaton. More than this, we may even try to predict the mechanism or dynamism of the human psyche as well. But man is more than psyche. Avery's getting mad at you. Stop. Good girl, Avery. Stop. Of the human psyche as well. But man is more than psyche. Freedom, however, is not the last word. Freedom is only part of the story and half of the truth. Freedom is but the negative aspect of the whole phenomenon, whose positive aspect is responsibleness. In fact, freedom is in danger of degenerating into mere arbitrariness unless it is lived in terms of responsibleness. This is why I recommend that the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast be supplanted by a statue of responsibility on the West Coast. There is nothing conceivable which would so condition a man. Excuse me, guys, please. Go on. Billy, go on. Knock it off. This is serious. This is serious book. You can't be out here humping. Go on. Stop. There is nothing conceivable which would so condition a man as to leave him without the slightest freedom. Therefore, a residue of freedom, however limited it may be, is left to man, is neurotic, and even psychotic cases. Indeed, the innermost core of the patient's personality is not even touched by a psychosis. An incurable psychotic individual may lose his usefulness but yet retain the dignity of a human being. This is my psychiatric credo.